The rhythmic thud of the heavy bag was the only sound in the gym until the cold, metallic click of a hammer cocking back silenced everything. One mission. One target. And one impossible ultimatum. Zafira Kane was the best corporate fixer in the business, but tonight, she wasn't fixing a deal, she was being forced into a death trap. The Syndicate gave her a choice: infiltrate the inner circle of Seo Jae-kyung, the lethal dragon of the East, and win his heart. Or watch everyone she loves disappear. But what Zafira didn't know was that seducing a man with a heart made of Siberian ice wouldn't be the hardest part of the job. It was the fact that the man covered in ink and iron, the man who ruled the underworld with blood and silence, was already waiting for her to make her move. Zafira Kane thought she was the one playing the game. She walked into Jae-kyung's world prepared to be a predator, armed with a master's degree in manipulation and a heart of stone. Instead, she stepped into a web of honor, danger, and a connection so intense it threatened to burn her mission to the ground. In tonight's story, the hunter becomes the hunted, secrets become currency, and a black woman tasked with an impossible hit finds out that the man she was supposed to destroy might be the only one capable of setting her free. Before we dive into the shadows of the Seo Empire, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in this world, trust is a luxury, love is a liability, and the ending will shock everyone. Before we continue the amazing story, kindly hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any of our stories. Now, let's begin Zafira's story. The air inside the gilded den tasted of expensive bourbon and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. It was the kind of place where fortunes were traded like pocket change and secrets were buried beneath the lush velvet carpets. Zafira moved through the room with the practiced grace of a woman who belonged, her black evening dress whispering against her heels. She didn't look for him with her eyes, she felt him. Seo Jae-kyung sat at the center table, a black-clothed monolith of power. The warm golden light of the overhead chandelier caught the sharp line of his jaw and the intricate black ink that climbed his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. He was focused on his cards, his presence so heavy it seemed to pull the very oxygen from the room. Zafira didn't approach him with a smile or a flick of her hair. She knew the dossier's warning: he smells desperation like a shark smells blood. Instead, she waited for the seat directly across from him to vacate. When it did, she slid into it, her expression as cool and unreadable as the marble in his foyer. "The buy-in is $250,000, miss," the dealer murmured, his eyes flickering to Jae-kyung as if asking permission. "I can read the sign," Zafira replied, her voice smooth and steady. She slid a stack of high-denomination chips forward. Jae-kyung didn't look up immediately. He played a hand, winning with a cold efficiency that made the other players at the table visibly sweat. It was only when the next deal began that his intense gaze finally lifted. He didn't look at her dress or her jewelry, he looked straight into her eyes, searching for the crack in her armor. Zafira didn't blink. The game wasn't about the cards, it was about the math, the psychology, and the silence. For 3 rounds, Zafira played conservatively, folding when the odds dipped even a fraction. She watched him. She noted the way his finger tapped the table. Not out of nervousness, but as a rhythmic countdown. On the 4th round, the pot grew bloated. Jae-kyung raised, a move intended to bully the remaining players into submission. One by one, they folded. When it came to Zafira, the room went silent. She calculated the deck, the previous burns, and the subtle shift in Jae-kyung's posture. He wasn't bluffing, but he was overconfident. "I'll see your raise," Zafira said, her voice a calm anchor in the tension. "And I'll double it." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Jae-kyung's eyes narrowed, a predatory glint appearing in their depths. He leaned forward, the tattoos on his neck shifting with the movement. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Kane," he said, his voice a low, melodic growl. He knew her name. The game had truly begun. "I find safety boring, Mr. Seo," she countered. She revealed her hand, not a lucky flush, but a calculated sequence that dismantled his own. She hadn't won by chance. She had outthought him. As the dealer pushed the mountain of chips toward her, Jae-kyung didn't look angry. Instead, he leaned back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a guest, he was looking at a peer. Zafira had won the pot, but more importantly, she had won the one thing he never gave away, his genuine interest. The heavy silence that followed Zafira's win didn't last long. It was punctured not by applause, but by the jagged, rhythmic spray of gunfire from the lobby. The transition from high-stakes elegance to lethal chaos happened in a heartbeat. Screams tore through the velvet-muffled air of the gilded den as the double doors burst open. Men in tactical gear, faces obscured by masks, flooded the room. They weren't there for the money on the tables, their barrels were leveled with singular, deadly intent at the man sitting across from Zafira. Jae-kyung didn't panic. His reaction was a terrifying display of conditioned reflex. He flipped the heavy mahogany card table in one fluid motion, creating a barricade as his own security detail engaged. But the attackers had the advantage of the surprise. A shooter flanked the left side, emerging from the service kitchen with a submachine gun aimed directly at Jae-kyung's exposed side. Zafira saw the movement before the bodyguards did. This was the moment. The variable she hadn't anticipated but knew how to exploit. Her training as a fixer had taught her that the most convincing lie is the one written in blood. As the shooter squeezed the trigger, Zafira lunged. She didn't think, she moved with a desperate, calculated speed, throwing herself into Jae-kyung's space. A searing line of fire carved its way across her upper arm as the bullet grazed her skin, the impact spinning her around before she collapsed against his chest. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and iron. Jae-kyung's hand, large and calloused, caught her before she hit the floor. His other hand pulled a concealed weapon from his waistband, returning fire with a surgical precision that ended the flanker's life in 2 shots. "You're hit," he rasped, his voice dropping into a register of pure, dark steel. Zafira leaned into him, her fingers clutching his lapel, forcing her breathing to stay shallow and ragged. The white silk of her dress was rapidly blooming with a deep, crimson stain. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a carefully curated mix of shock and instinctive loyalty. I couldn't let them," she whispered, letting her head fall back against his shoulder as the room blurred. The skirmish was over as quickly as it had begun. Jae-kyung's men moved with grim efficiency, neutralizing the remaining attackers and sealing the exits. One of his lieutenants rushed over, medical kit in hand, but Jae-kyung waved him off. He scooped Zafira into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. "Cancel the doctors at the clinic," Jae-kyung commanded, his gaze never leaving Zafira's pale face. "We're going to the estate. My private physician will meet us there." "Sir, the protocols," the lieutenant began. "She bled for me," Jae-kyung interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. "She goes where I go." The ride in the armored SUV was a blur of neon city lights and the steady, grounding thrum of Jae-kyung's heartbeat beneath her ear. He held her close, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw in a gesture that was half possessive, half protective. Zafira kept her eyes closed, suppressing the urge to smile. The gates of the Seo estate, a sprawling fortress of black stone and glass hidden in the hills, swung open like the jaws of a dragon. This was the inner sanctum, a place the Syndicate had spent years trying to map. As Jae-kyung carried her through the grand foyer, past the silent, bowing staff and into a master suite that smelled of sandalwood and power, Zafira knew the hook was set. She had traded a few inches of skin for the ultimate access. She was no longer just a woman who had caught his eye at a poker table, she was the woman who had saved the life of the dragon. And in Jae-kyung's world, a debt of blood was the only thing that truly mattered. The recovery at the Seo estate was less like a convalescence and more like a slow, deliberate seduction of the senses. Zafira spent her first 3 days wrapped in silk sheets that cost more than her first apartment, her every need attended to by a staff that moved with the silent precision of ghosts. But it wasn't the luxury that unnerved her, it was the man who came with it. Jae-kyung did not delegate her care. Each evening, when the sun dipped below the Hudson and cast long, golden shadows across the minimalist architecture of his bedroom, he would appear. He would sit on the edge of her bed, his large, tattooed hand surprisingly gentle as he replaced the bandage on her arm. During these moments, the dragon was silent, his focus entirely on the knit of her skin. Zafira watched him, her fixer's mind cataloging the way his black shirt strained against his shoulders and the scent of sandalwood and rain that seemed to cling to his skin. She was supposed to be looking for weaknesses, hidden safes, contact lists, names of lieutenants, but her gaze kept catching on the ink that climbed his throat like protective armor. "You're staring," he murmured one evening, his eyes remaining on her arm. "I'm trying to figure you out," Zafira countered, her voice leaning into the soft, vulnerable register she'd practiced for the Syndicate. "People call you a monster, Jae-kyung. But monsters don't have hands this steady." He finally looked up, his dark eyes searching hers. "Steady hands are a requirement for my line of work, Zafira. It doesn't make me a saint." The facade she had built began to crack on the fourth night. Feeling restless, Zafira slipped out of the suite and followed the low hum of voices toward the rear of the estate. She found herself on a balcony overlooking a hidden courtyard. Below, Jae-kyung wasn't presiding over a drug deal or an execution. Instead, he was meeting with a group of elderly residents from the neighboring district, men and women with weathered faces and bowed heads. She watched from the shadows as he listened to a grandmother speak through tears about a local developer trying to seize her storefront. Jae-kyung didn't shout or posture. He simply nodded, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. He handed a thick envelope to one of his men and gave a short, sharp command in Korean. The woman bowed deeply, her relief palpable even from the balcony. This was the Mafia justice the files hadn't detailed. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a sovereign. He was the wall between these people and a world that wanted to grind them into the dirt. As the crowd dispersed, Jae-kyung looked up, spotting Zafira in the moonlight. He didn't look angry at being caught in a moment of benevolence, he looked weary. He joined her on the balcony, the night air cool against their skin. "They have no one else," he said simply, answering the question she hadn't asked. "In my world, power isn't about what you take. It's about what you're willing to protect." Zafira felt a sharp, uncomfortable pang in her chest. For years, she had survived by treating people as assets and liabilities. She was a fixer, a ghost, a woman who belonged to no one. But as she stood beside this man, watching the way the moon caught the silver in his hair and the intensity of his profile, the lie she was living began to feel heavy. She was supposed to deliver his head to the Syndicate. She was supposed to win his heart only to break it. But as Jae-kyung reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt like a promise, Zafira realized the most dangerous part of her mission wasn't the Mafia boss himself. It was the fact that for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be the one who fixed the situation. She wanted to be the one he protected. Her acting was no longer a script, it was becoming a confession. And in the world of the Seo Mafia, a confession was often the first step toward a beautiful, velvet-lined grave. The fifth morning at the estate began with a silence that felt heavy, like the air before a storm. There was no silk-draped breakfast or quiet conversation on the balcony. Instead, two of Jae-kyung's men, faces as expressionless as stone, escorted Zafira down to the sublevel of the mansion. A place where the luxury of the upper floors gave way to industrial concrete and the hum of high-end ventilation. In the center of a dimly lit, soundproofed room, Jae-kyung stood with his back to her. He was dressed in a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink-stained muscle of his forearms. Before him, a man was tied to a chair, bruised and trembling, his muffled pleas lost behind a heavy strip of duct tape. As Zafira entered, Jae-kyung turned. His eyes were no longer the warm, searching depths she had seen in the moonlight, they were shards of obsidian, cold and final. Without a word, he reached for a velvet case on a nearby table and pulled out a sleek, matte black semi-automatic. He checked the chamber with a crisp, metallic snap that echoed off the walls, then held it out to her, handle first. "His name is Minho," Jae-kyung said, his voice a low, clinical rasp. "He was the one who leaked the location of the gilded den to the Syndicate. He's the reason you have a scar on your arm, Zafira." He's the reason I almost lost my life. Zafira felt the weight of the mission pressing against her ribs. This was it. The Syndicate had told her she would eventually have to prove herself, but she hadn't expected the test to be so raw, so visceral. She looked at the gun, then at the terrified man in the chair. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm, but she kept her face a mask of calm. The Syndicate wants his head, Jae-kyung continued, his gaze narrowing. And I want to know who you really are. A woman who takes a bullet for a stranger is either a saint or a professional. Which is it, Zafira? End him, and we move forward as partners. No more secrets. Zafira took the weapon. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of oil. She raised it, her arms steady, the sights aligning with the center of Minho's chest. The man in the chair let out a whimpering sob, his eyes wide with the realization that his life was balanced on the finger of a woman he didn't know. The room felt like it was shrinking. Zafira's finger curled around the trigger. If she pulled it, the Syndicate would be satisfied, and her cover would be ironclad. She would be the Mafia queen, the trusted assassin. But as she looked at Jae-kyung, she saw something flickering beneath his icy exterior, a challenge, or perhaps a hope. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Zafira lowered the gun. She didn't drop it, she simply turned and placed it back in the velvet case. No, she said, her voice echoing with a quiet, unbreakable strength. Jae-kyung's jaw tightened. You're refusing? He nearly killed you. I took that graze because I chose to save a life, not because I have a taste for taking them, Zafira replied, stepping closer to him, refusing to flinch from his predatory aura. If you wanted a mindless soldier, you should have hired one. I am a fixer, Jae-kyung. I solve problems with my mind, not by adding more blood to your floors. If he's a traitor, deal with him according to your laws, but don't expect me to lose my soul just to prove my loyalty to you. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could snap. The bodyguards shifted, their hands moving toward their holsters, waiting for the signal to eliminate the woman who had just defied the dragon. Instead, Jae-kyung let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh in another life. The lethal darkness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of profound, startling respect. He signaled to his men, who immediately stepped forward to untie the prisoner, not to kill him, but to lead him away. You passed, Jae-kyung murmured, stepping into her personal space until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin just below her ear. If you had pulled that trigger, I would have known you were exactly what I feared, a plant sent by people who don't understand that power requires a conscience. But you chose mercy over convenience. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. I don't need a killer, Zafira. I have plenty of those. I need someone who isn't afraid to look me in the eye and say no. In that moment, the trust between them shifted from a tactical alliance to something far more dangerous. He wasn't just her target anymore. He was a man who had looked for her humanity and found it, and Zafira realized with a sinking heart that the more he trusted her, the harder it was going to be to destroy him. The heavy, metallic tension of the basement lingered in Zafira's bones long after they returned to the upper floors of the estate. Rain began to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the library, blurring the city lights into a smear of neon blue and gold. Jae-kyung had retreated into a rare, contemplative silence, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid that caught the firelight. Zafira knew this was her window. The Syndicate's deadline was screaming in the back of her mind, reminding her that mercy didn't fulfill a contract. She had to move now. She had to win the rest of him. She crossed the room, the silk of her robe trailing behind her like a shadow. Instead of taking the chair across from him, she sank onto the rug near his feet, resting her uninjured arm against his knee. It was a classic move of feigned submission, a calculated invitation. She looked up at him, her dark eyes shimmering with a vulnerability that was half fixer and half woman. You've spent all week dissecting my soul, Jae-kyung, she whispered, her voice a low, melodic lure. But you're still a fortress. Tell me about the ink. You said you don't need a mindless killer, but you carry the marks of a man who has seen too much death. Jae-kyung looked down at her, his hand pausing over his glass. For a moment, she thought he would brush her off with a cold remark. Instead, he set the drink aside and leaned back, his fingers tracing the collar of his shirt. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unbuttoned the top 3, exposing the full breadth of the tattoos that spiraled up his throat. Most people see these and see a monster, he said, his voice dropping into a raspy, intimate confession. He traced a jagged, feathered wing that disappeared behind his ear. This was for my brother. He was 20 when he took a bullet meant for me. He wanted to be a painter. Now, he's just ink on my skin. His fingers moved to a series of intricate Korean characters etched along his carotid artery. These are names. Not of enemies I've slain, but of the families in the district who lost sons and daughters because I wasn't fast enough, or strong enough, to stop the syndicates from moving in. He looked at her, his gaze raw and stripped of his usual authority. Every time I look in the mirror, I am reminded that my power is built on the graves of people I was supposed to protect. It's not armor, Zafira. It's a ledger of my failures. The air in the library shifted. The seduction Zafira had planned, the practiced touches, the scripted sighs, withered in the heat of his honesty. She had expected a story of conquest, of a man marking his territory. She hadn't expected a man who carried his grief like a crown of thorns. She reached up, her fingers trembling, not from the act, but from a sudden, terrifying surge of genuine empathy. She traced the line of his collarbone, her skin a deep, striking contrast against his. You carry the weight of the world on your neck, she murmured, her voice thick with an emotion she could no longer categorize as work. And you, Jae-kyung said, catching her hand and pressing her palm against the ink-stained heat of his skin. You carry the weight of a secret that's eating you alive. Zafira's breath hitched. The walls she had built since childhood. The cold, corporate fixer who saw everyone as a chess piece, didn't just crack, they disintegrated. In the silence of the library, with the rain hammering against the glass and the fire dying in the grate, she realized she wasn't looking at a target anymore. She was looking at the only person who had ever truly seen her. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his chest, the scent of sandalwood and rain filling her lungs. She was supposed to be winning his heart to deliver his head, but as he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the terrifying safety of his embrace, Zafira knew the truth. She had successfully infiltrated his world, but in the process, she had lost her own. The fixer was broken, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to fix a single thing. The sanctuary of the library felt like a distant dream the following afternoon when the reality of Zafira's double life arrived in a plain, courier-stamped box. Inside, tucked beneath a layer of mundane architectural blueprints, lay a small, crystalline vial no larger than a lipstick. There was no note, but the syndicate's message was deafening. The time for confessions was over. The toxin inside was a masterpiece of chemistry, tasteless, odorless, and undetectable by standard toxicology. It didn't kill instantly, it caused a slow, systemic failure that looked like a tragic heart attack brought on by stress. The syndicate had even provided the stage, the gold and black charity gala, the social event of the season where Jae-kyung was expected to make a rare, public appearance. Zafira stood in the center of her suite, the vial pressed so hard into her palm that the glass threatened to shatter. She looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The polished waves of her hair, the glamorous makeup, the dangling earrings that caught the light. She looked like a queen, but she felt like a ghost. For the first time in her career, her fixer instincts were failing her. There was no middle ground left, no clever maneuver to save everyone. The door chattered open, and Jae-kyung stepped in. He had traded his tactical gear for a bespoke black suit that radiated authority. He looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face with an intensity that made her chest ache. He didn't see a spy, he saw the woman who had chosen mercy in a basement and shared his grief in the moonlight. The cars are waiting, Zafira, he said, his voice dropping into that low, possessive register that used to be her target but was now her anchor. He walked toward her, noticing the way she pulled her hand behind her back. You look troubled. If the crowd is too much, we don't have to go. My world is wherever you are. I'm fine, she lied, the word tasting like ash. Just nerves. It's a big night. It is, he agreed, reaching out to adjust the strap of her dress. His touch was a brand, a reminder of the man he was, the protector of the weak, the man who wore his failures on his skin. Tonight, the city sees us together. No more shadows. As he turned to lead her out, Zafira's phone vibrated in her clutch. A single text message from an unknown number, tonight. Or your family's blood is on the marble. The pressure was a physical weight, a crushing force that made every breath a struggle. As they descended the grand staircase of the estate, the vial felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her silk purse. She was a master of psychological manipulation, a woman who viewed people as chess pieces, yet she was currently the one being moved across the board. She looked at the side of Jae-kyung's face, at the tattoos on his neck that told the story of his honor. To save her family, she had to destroy the only man who had ever truly known her. To save him, she had to sacrifice everything she had ever worked for. The ride to the gala was a suffocating silence. The golden lighting of the city streets flickered across Jae-kyung's serious, focused profile. He reached over, taking her hand in his thumb tracing the back of her palm in a silent gesture of support. Zafira forced her fingers to remain still, though her heart was screaming. When the SUV pulled up to the red carpet, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi created a wall of blinding white light. The crowd was already thick with New York's elite, their faces blurred by Zafira's rising panic. She stepped out into the night, the elegant black evening dress clinging to her like a shroud. The gala was a sea of gold and black, a mirror of the man beside her. Somewhere in this room, a syndicate handler was watching. Somewhere in her purse, the poison waited. As Jae-kyung led her toward the bar, his hand firm and protective on the small of her back, Zafira realized that the poison chalice wasn't just the drink she was supposed to fix, it was the life she had chosen. The breaking point had arrived, and as the waiter approached with a tray of crystal champagne flutes, Zafira knew that by the end of the night, someone would be dead, and her soul would be the first casualty. The golden hour had begun to bleed into a bruised purple over the Manhattan skyline, but inside the master suite, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and cold dread. Zafira stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her skin a deep, radiant glow against the white silk of her robe. On the bed lay the Syndicate's toxin, a tiny glass shard of death hidden inside her clutch. The door opened, and Jae-kyung stepped in. He wasn't dressed in the casual knits of their library nights, he was the dragon tonight. His black suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, and the tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic life of their own. In his hands, he carried a long, narrow box of midnight blue velvet. He didn't speak. He walked to her, his presence commanding the space, and placed the box on the vanity. When he flipped the lid, the room seemed to ignite. Resting on the silk was a dress of liquid black obsidian, the one from her dreams, but better. Beside it lay a necklace of raw, uncut diamonds that looked like fallen stars. A queen should wear her crown before she enters the battlefield, Jae-kyung murmured, his voice a low, melodic vibration that settled in Zafira's marrow. Zafira reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cool stones. Jae-kyung, I don't know if I can do this. He moved behind her, his large hands settling on her shoulders. His gaze met hers in the mirror, intense, focused, and terrifyingly perceptive. He didn't offer comfort, he offered a mirror to her own soul. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear as his hands slid down to her waist, pulling her back against the hard heat of his chest. I've known since the night at the poker table, Zafira, he whispered, his words sending a shockwave through her system. I knew they sent you. I knew the Syndicate held the leash. I even knew when the courier arrived yesterday with that little glass vial. Zafira froze. The blood drained from her face, her heart hammering a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. She tried to turn, but his grip was a velvet vice, grounding her. I waited, he continued, his voice dropping into a rasp of pure, raw honesty. I waited to see if you would pull the trigger in the basement. I waited to see if you would lie to me in the library. And every time, you chose the truth of who you are over the lie they told you to be. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object, placing it on the vanity next to the diamonds. It was a burner phone, the one the Syndicate had been using to threaten her family. The dress is a gift. The diamonds are a promise, Jae-kyung said, finally releasing her and stepping back. He looked at her then, not as a boss, but as a man offering her the only thing he truly owned, his life. But the choice is yours. I know exactly what you carry in your purse, Zafira. I know the poison is meant for my glass. If you want my empire to fall, if you want to be free of them by becoming their assassin, then do it. I won't stop you. He walked toward the door, stopping with his hand on the frame. He didn't look back. But if you want to stop being a fixer for men who view you as a tool, then put on the dress. Stand by my side. And together, we will burn their world to the ground. Choose wisely, Zafira. Because after tonight, there is no going back. The door clicked shut, leaving her in a silence so profound it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Zafira looked at the black dress, the diamonds, and the hidden vial in her bag. The Syndicate offered her safety through a life of shadows and blood. Jae-kyung offered her a throne built on a precipice. Her hand reached out, hovering between the poison and the diamonds. The fixer in her wanted to find a third way, a trick, a clever escape. But as she looked at her reflection, at the woman who had felt the heartbeat of the dragon, she realized there was no fixing this. There was only the transformation. Slowly, Zafira reached for the obsidian dress. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a dizzying kaleidoscope of gold leaf and black silk, a sanctuary for the city's most powerful families. But as the double doors swung open and Seo Jae-kyung entered with Zafira Kane on his arm, the music seemed to falter. The dragon had arrived, and by his side stood a woman who radiated the kind of dangerous, obsidian beauty that made the room's elite look like flickering candles. Zafira felt every eye on them, the judgment of the old guard and the calculated stares of the Syndicate's plants hidden in the crowd. The liquid black dress clung to her like a second skin, and the diamonds at her throat felt cold, a stark contrast to the heat of Jae-kyung's hand on the small of her back. She could feel the weight of the vial in her clutch, a tiny, jagged tooth of ice ready to bite. Steady, Jae-kyung murmured, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. The stage is yours, Zafira. Show them why you were the one I chose. They moved toward the center of the room, stopping near a circular bar where crystal flutes were being filled with vintage champagne. A waiter approached, his eyes darting nervously toward Zafira, a subtle signal. This was the handler's pawn. This was the moment. Zafira reached into her bag, her fingers finding the cold glass of the vial. With the practiced precision of a fixer, she palmed the toxin as she accepted 2 glasses of champagne. As Jae-kyung turned to acknowledge a greeting from a high-ranking senator, Zafira's hand moved in a blur of motion over one of the flutes. The clear liquid didn't change color. It didn't fizz. It just sat there, lethal and waiting. She turned back to Jae-kyung, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared it would shatter the diamonds at her neck. She held out the glass. Her mission was seconds from completion. Freedom was a sip away. But as she looked into his eyes, the eyes that had seen her mercy in a basement and her soul in a library, the air left her lungs. She saw the man who had offered her his life as a choice. She saw the man who had already forgiven her for what she was about to do. The Syndicate wanted a sacrifice. They wanted blood for blood. In a move that stunned the socialites watching from the wings, Zafira didn't hand the glass to Jae-kyung. Instead, she pulled it back toward her own lips. If the Syndicate needed a body to settle the debt, she would give them hers. She would rather swallow the darkness herself than be the one to extinguish the light in the only man who had ever truly seen her. To the choices we make, she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. She tilted the glass, the poisoned wine touching her lips. Before a single drop could cross her teeth, a hand as fast as a striking cobra surged forward. Jae-kyung didn't just grab her wrist, he struck the flute with such force that it exploded in a spray of crystal and gold. The glass shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Waiters froze. Socialites recoiled. Jae-kyung stepped into her space, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying, protective rage. He didn't look at the mess on the floor, he looked only at her. He caught her face in his hands, his thumbs pressing into her cheeks with a desperate intensity. "Did you think I would let you?" he hissed, his voice a raw, jagged edge of emotion. "Did you think I would stand here and watch you die for men who aren't fit to breathe your air?" "Jae-kyung, they'll kill them," Zafira gasped, tears finally breaking through her composure. "My family. I couldn't." "I told you to choose," he interrupted, his forehead dropping against hers as he shielded her from the prying eyes of the elite. "And you chose me. That's all I needed to know." He straightened up, his hand sliding down to grip hers with a strength that promised he would never let go. He turned to the room, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of New York's high society, looking for the monsters in the shadows. The dragon was no longer merely present, he was on the hunt. "The gala is over," Jae-kyung announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom with the weight of a death sentence. "And for those of you waiting for a show, the real one is just beginning." The silence that followed the shattering of the champagne flute was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the ballroom. Zafira stood trembling in the center of the wreckage, her eyes wide as she looked at Jae-kyung. She expected the Syndicate's handlers to storm the floor, expected the sting of a bullet or the cold click of handcuffs. Instead, Jae-kyung pulled her closer, his arm a solid, unbreakable band around her waist. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted tablet, tapping the screen once. "Look at the monitors, Zafira," he commanded, his voice echoing with a terrifyingly calm authority. The massive digital displays surrounding the gala, which had been showcasing charity milestones, suddenly flickered and changed. They didn't show statistics or smiling children. They showed live, grainy feeds from the Syndicate's various headquarters across the city. Zafira's breath hitched as she saw the familiar faces of her tormentors, the men who had threatened her family, the handlers who had held her leash, being led out in zip ties by men wearing the Seo crest. "While you were agonizing over a vial of poison, I was doing what a dragon does," Jae-kyung whispered against her temple. "I didn't just track the courier, Zafira. I traced the money, the lineage, and the locations. By the time we stepped into the car tonight, the Syndicate ceased to exist." Zafira looked up at him, her face a mask of shock. You knew everything. You could have stopped me days ago. Why let it go this far? Why let me walk onto this floor with that poison?" Jae-kyung's gaze softened, but the fire behind it remained. "Because I didn't need a fixer, Zafira. I have 1,000 men who can fix a problem. I needed to know if you were the partner I believed you to be. I needed you to choose me, not because you were forced, and not because it was the smart move, but because your heart belonged to mine as much as mine belongs to yours." He turned her toward the crowd of socialites and rivals, who were now whispering in frantic, terrified tones as they realized the power dynamic of the city had shifted permanently in a single evening. The Kongs, the Chins, and the remnants of the old guard looked on with pale faces. They weren't just looking at a mafia boss anymore. They were looking at an empire that had just been unified by a bond stronger than any contract. "The Syndicate is gone," Jae-kyung announced to the room, his voice dropping into a register of pure, cold steel. "And the woman by my side is no longer a guest in this city. She is the Seo crown. From this moment forward, her word is my command. Her enemies are my prey." He reached out, taking the obsidian diamonds at her throat and adjusting them with a possessive, tender touch. The crowd stayed frozen, the weight of his declaration settling over the room like a physical force. Zafira felt the last of the Syndicate's chains fall away, replaced by something far more intoxicating, agency. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fixing someone else's mess. She was standing at the summit. I was tasked with winning your heart, Zafira murmured, her voice finally steady as she leaned into him, her hand resting over the ink on his neck. You didn't have to win it, Zafira, Jae-kyung replied, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his serious mask as he led her toward the exit. It was yours the moment you beat me at that table. Now, let's go home. We have an empire to run. As they walked out of the plaza, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi created a white-hot path for them. They didn't look back at the chaos they left behind. They stood together, the fixer and the dragon, the ink and the ivory. The most powerful couple the city had ever seen. The mission was over, but the rain had just begun.